The radio crackled with static, then silence. In the operations center at Bagram Airfield, every eye locked onto the same grid coordinate. The firebase had gone dark 3 minutes ago. No response. No distress call. Just the flat hiss of dead air where 23 voices should have been. Major Collins gripped the edge of the map table, knuckles white against the laminated surface. Outside, the Hindu Kush mountains cut jagged silhouettes against a sky turning the color of old bruises. Someone needed to go in. Someone needed to go now. But the valley was a kill box, and everyone in that room knew it. The SEALs had been operating in Kunar province for 6 weeks. Quiet insertions, clean extractions, textbook operations that never made the news because that's how they were supposed to go. But this morning something had changed. The mountains had teeth, and they just closed around Outpost Viper like a steel trap. Intelligence suggested maybe 40 hostiles, but intelligence had been wrong before. The kind of wrong that filled body bags and ruined careers. The kind of wrong that turned senators into ghosts and made generals drink alone. "We need close air support in that valley now," Collins said, voice flat and final. His request hung in the recycled air of the operations center, heavy as a death sentence. Every pilot knew what Kunar meant. The valley walls rose 3,000 feet on both sides, creating a natural funnel where surface-to-air missiles could track you from launch to impact with geometric certainty. Helicopters had been shredded there. Fast movers had been forced to abort. The mountains didn't care about your training or your technology. They just waited. Lieutenant Cade Mercer stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, watching the digital readouts flicker and change. She'd been at Bagram for 7 months, flying combat missions in an A-10 Thunderbolt II that ground crews had nicknamed Gravedigger, for reasons nobody liked to discuss in daylight. She was 29, compact and wire-strong, with dark hair pulled back so tight it could have been painted on. Her call sign was Widow, and the story behind it was the kind people whispered about in the Chow Hall when they thought she couldn't hear. They said her plane came back when others didn't. They said she flew through things that should have killed her. They said a lot of things, most of them meant to diminish, to explain away, to make sense of something they couldn't quite categorize. The operations officer scanned the room, looking for volunteers, looking for someone crazy enough or skilled enough or desperate enough to thread that needle. His eyes passed over Mercer once, then twice, then stopped. "Widow," he said quietly, "you're up." She didn't hesitate, didn't argue or calculate odds or ask for better intelligence. She just nodded once, picked up her helmet and walked toward the door. Behind her, someone muttered something about sending a woman into a grinder. She didn't turn around. She'd heard worse, proved more. The door sealed behind her with a pneumatic hiss that sounded almost like relief, and the room exhaled a collective breath they didn't know they'd been holding. Outside, the tarmac shimmered with heat already, and Gravedigger sat waiting on the flight line like a gray ghost made of titanium and malice. The A-10 was never pretty. It was built around a gun so massive it could shred tanks, with engines mounted high to avoid debris and armor plating thick enough to stop most of what the ground could throw at it. It was ugly, blunt, and honest. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. A flying gun designed to survive hell and come back asking for more. Mercer ran through her pre-flight with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 500 times, hands moving over switches and dials with muscle memory precision. The crew chief, a staff sergeant named Riordan with grease under his nails and worry in his eyes, handed her the mission brief. Single sheet, grid coordinates, frequency for the ground team, weather decent, enemy activity confirmed. Translation: you're flying into chaos with partial information and no backup close enough to matter. "Bring her back, Lieutenant," Riordan said, slapping the fuselage twice like patting a loyal dog. Mercer climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and began the startup sequence. The twin General Electric turbofans spooled up with a rising whine that turned into a steady roar. She ran through systems checks while listening to the tactical frequency, piecing together the situation from fragmented radio calls. The SEALs were pinned down, taking fire from elevated positions. Casualties unknown. Air support requested 15 minutes ago. Every second that passed was another second. Someone might be bleeding out in the dust. She taxied to the runway, received clearance, and pushed the throttles forward. Gravedigger accelerated with surprising speed for something so heavy, and the nose lifted as she pulled back on the stick. The mountains rose ahead, indifferent and eternal, and she banked toward them with the sunrise breaking behind her like a promise nobody had asked for. The flight to Kunar took 18 minutes. 18 minutes of calculating approach angles and scanning threat indicators, and listening to the radio paint a picture of desperation. The JTAC on the ground, call sign Anvil 3, had a voice like gravel being crushed under tank treads. He was calm the way people get calm when panic becomes useless. Any station, this is Anvil 3. We are danger close. Repeat, danger close. Multiple casualties. Request immediate CAS. Enemy positions North Ridge, approximately 200 meters from our location. Mercer keyed her mic. Anvil 3, Widow, 2 minutes out, authenticate. Widow, Anvil 3, authentication Lima Whiskey. He paused, static crackled. We're in a bad spot here, real bad. She didn't respond with false comfort or motivational speeches. She responded with information. Copy. Inbound with 30mm and Mavericks. Mark your position. Marking with smoke, green smoke. The valley opened below her like a wound in the earth. Steep walls of rock and scree, narrow floor choked with vegetation, and threading through it all a thin river that looked like a silver vein from 5,000 feet. She could see the firebase now, a small cluster of structures and barriers that looked absurdly fragile from up here. Green smoke billowed from the center, and around it, muzzle flashes sparked from the northern ridge like fireflies in the morning light. She descended, dropping into the valley with controlled aggression, feeling the air currents shift and buffet the aircraft. This was where you earned your pay, where physics and tactics intersected with violence. The AAA threat indicators lit up immediately. Someone down there had shoulder-fired missiles or heavy machine guns calibrated for aircraft. She jinked left, spoiling their tracking solution, and armed her weapons systems. Widow has visual, engaging. The gun. That's what the A-10 was built for. 7 barrels rotating at 4,000 rounds per minute, firing 30mm depleted uranium shells that could punch through concrete and armor plate. The sound it made was somewhere between a chainsaw and divine judgment. She lined up her approach, calculated wind and distance and friendly positions with the part of her brain that never slept. Her finger rested on the trigger. The ridge filled her heads-up display. She squeezed. The GAU-8 Avenger roared. The entire aircraft shuddered as the gun fired, slowing her airspeed from the recoil. The rounds walked across the ridge in a line of destruction that vaporized rock and flesh with equal indifference. She counted 2 seconds and released, pulling up and banking hard right as tracers reached up toward her like angry fingers. Something pinged off the armored tub surrounding her cockpit. She ignored it, came around for another pass. Good hits, Widow, good hits. We need more on that same position. She rolled in again. This time she saw figures running, scattering, trying to find cover that didn't exist. The gun spoke again. 30mm rounds traveling at 3,000 feet per second, each one carrying enough kinetic energy to tear a human body into component parts. It wasn't clean. It wasn't pretty. But it was effective, and effectiveness was the only metric that mattered when your people were dying below. The northern ridge went quiet. Anvil 3 targets destroyed. Say status. Static, heavy breathing. Then, Widow, you just saved our asses. We're still taking fire from the eastern slope. Can you engage? She checked her fuel, checked her ammunition counter, still had enough. Copy, coming around. For the next 20 minutes, Cade Mercer worked that valley like a surgeon with a chainsaw, methodically eliminating every hostile position that revealed itself. She took fire 7 times. Small arms, heavy machine guns, 1 missile that went stupid and corkscrewed into a cliff face. She felt each impact through the airframe, felt Gravedigger absorb punishment that would have downed anything else in the inventory. The A-10 could fly with one engine, one tail, half a wing. It was designed by people who understood that close air support meant getting close, and getting close meant getting hit. When her ammunition finally ran dry, the valley had transformed. The fire base was still standing. The SEALs were still alive. And the mountains, those ancient indifferent sentinels, had witnessed another small human drama played out in smoke and fire and radio static. Anvil 3 Widow, Winchester RTB. Widow, the JTAC's voice cracked slightly, the calm facade finally fracturing. Thank you, Sirius. You kept us alive. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Just banked north and climbed out of the valley, leaving the smoke and silence behind. The flight back to Bagram felt longer somehow. Adrenaline draining away, leaving behind the hollow feeling that always came after. She'd killed people today. Killed them efficiently and without hesitation because they were trying to kill her people. The moral mathematics were simple even if the emotional aftermath wasn't. When she landed, there was a crowd waiting on the tarmac. Unusual. She taxied to her spot, shut down the engines, and climbed out. Riordan was there, eyes wide, doing a visual inspection of the aircraft. She counted 11 holes. 11 places where metal had been punctured, where systems had been compromised, where death had reached up and missed by inches. Jesus, Lieutenant, Riordan breathed. 11 hits and you brought her home. Collins was striding across the tarmac, face unreadable. Behind him, a group of men in different uniforms, beards, longer hair, eyes that had seen things. The SEALs had gotten out, gotten medevac back to Bagram within the hour. And now they were here, standing on the flight line, looking at her with expressions she couldn't quite parse. One of them stepped forward. Senior Chief, judging by the insignia barely visible under his kit. Face like weathered leather, scar tissue around his left eye. You widow? He asked. Lieutenant Mercer, she replied, pulling off her helmet. He studied her for a long moment, then extended his hand. Tyler Hagen, you saved 23 lives today, wanted to say that to your face. She shook his hand, aware of the crowd watching, aware that something was shifting in the social calculus of the base. Just doing my job, Senior Chief. That wasn't a job, that was art. He glanced back at his team, then back to her. We've worked with a lot of pilots, fast movers who drop from 30,000 and run, hellos who risk their rotors, but flying an A-10 into that valley the way you did with that precision, he shook his head. That's different, that's something else. The other SEALs nodded. One of them, younger with corporal stripes, spoke up. We were done, we knew it. Then we heard that gun, that beautiful, ugly gun, and we knew we had a chance. Collins stood there, arms crossed, letting the moment play out. This wasn't regulation, wasn't standard protocol, but protocol hadn't saved those men. Mercer had. And even the major, with all his by-the-book instincts, recognized that some things transcended paperwork. That night, in the officers' club that wasn't really a club so much as a plywood room with a refrigerator and folding chairs, the story spread. Not the sanitized version that would go in official reports. The real version. The one where a female pilot everyone had underestimated had flown into a valley that had killed better pilots and come out with 0 friendly casualties, and a plane that looked like it had been through a shredder. The one where the SEALs, who rarely showed deference to anyone outside their community, had lined up to shake her hand. Mercer sat in her quarters, cleaning her flight suit, picking rock dust and hydraulic fluid out of the seams. Her hands were steady. They always were. But her mind kept replaying the moment when the AAA indicators had lit up, when she'd known someone had a firing solution and she was committed to the attack run anyway. The split-second calculation that this was worth dying for, that those men on the ground, those strangers she'd never met and might never see again, were worth the risk. She'd made that calculation and not hesitated. That's what bothered her most, not that she'd risked her life, but that it had felt so automatic, so easy. Her call sign wasn't originally Widow because she came back when others didn't. It was Widow because 2 years ago, her fiancé had been killed in a training accident, helicopter crash, mechanical failure, routine flight that turned into a funeral. She'd been devastated in the quiet way that people who live with danger learn to manage devastation. She'd taken her grief and channeled it into something useful, into skill, into obsessive preparation, into becoming so good at her job that nobody could question it. The call sign had started as a cruel joke from a pilot she'd outflown in a training exercise. He'd meant it to hurt, to diminish, to mark her as damaged goods. Instead, she'd claimed it, owned it, turned it into something that made people pause. Widow, the one who survives, the one who comes back. She fell asleep in her clothes, still smelling like jet fuel and cordite, and dreamed of valleys and smoke and voices on the radio calling her name. The next morning brought attention she didn't want. Intelligence debriefs, maintenance reports, a formal interview for the after-action review that would dissect every second of the mission with clinical precision. She answered questions with facts, angles of attack, ammunition expenditure, threat response. She didn't mention the fear. Nobody ever asked about the fear. They assumed if you could do the job, fear wasn't part of the equation. But fear was always there. It was what you did with it that mattered. By lunch, the story had evolved. Already it was picking up embellishments, growing into something larger than what had actually happened. Someone said she'd taken out 50 hostiles. Someone else said she'd landed to provide medical aid. The truth was dramatic enough without exaggeration, but truth rarely satisfied the human need for myth. She ate alone in the chow hall, trying to be invisible, but pilots kept stopping by her table. Nods of respect, quick words of acknowledgement. Even the ones who'd whispered about women in combat, about whether she'd earned her wings or been given them by quota, even they couldn't argue with results. 23 men alive who should have been dead. And with 11 holes still flying. Math was math. Captain Voss, an F-16 pilot with more ego than flight hours, sat down across from her without asking. "Heard you had quite a day yesterday," he said, tone somewhere between genuine interest and jealousy. "It was a day," Mercer replied, not looking up from her meal. "Valley flying, that's old school. We don't do that anymore, too risky." "Someone had to." Voss leaned back, studying her. "You know what people are saying? They're saying you flew through a SAM envelope like it wasn't there. That you put rounds on targets so close to the friendlies you were practically shooting over their heads. That kind of precision, that kind of calculated risk, that's what separates good pilots from legends." She finally looked at him. His eyes were curious, measuring. "I'm not trying to be a legend, Captain. I'm trying to do my job and go home eventually." "Yeah, well, you might not get a choice. The SEALs are talking, and when SEALs talk, people listen." He stood up, grabbed his tray. "For what it's worth, I wouldn't have taken that mission. The risk-reward math doesn't work, but I'm glad you did, and I'm glad you made it back." After he left, she sat in the half-empty chow hall and thought about risk-reward calculations. How do you quantify a human life? How do you weigh your own survival against the survival of others? The equations never balanced cleanly. There was always a remainder, always something left over that couldn't be resolved by logic alone. She'd learned to live with that remainder, learned to carry it the way soldiers have always carried the weight of impossible choices. That afternoon, Collins called her into his office. He sat behind a desk covered in reports and maps and coffee cups that should have been thrown away days ago. He looked tired. Everyone looked tired. That was the baseline here. Exhaustion as normal operating procedure. "Sit down, Lieutenant." She sat back straight, hands on her knees. Collins shuffled papers for a moment, then looked up. "Command wants to put you in for a medal, probably a Distinguished Flying Cross. The SEALs are pushing for it. They've made it very clear that without your intervention they would have been overrun. They're not exaggerating. I've read the reports. The enemy force was larger than we thought, better equipped. If they'd held that position another 10 minutes, Outpost Viper would have fallen." She said nothing. "Medals were nice, but they didn't make you fly better. They didn't bring anyone back." I need to know something, Collins continued. When you took that mission, when you flew into that valley knowing the threat level, what were you thinking? I was thinking I'm the only CAS available, and Americans are dying, sir. That's it, no thoughts about your own survival, no hesitation. She met his eyes. Hesitation kills, sir, you taught me that. Collins nodded slowly. I did, but there's a difference between confidence and recklessness, between courage and... He trailed off, searching for the word. What happened to David? That wasn't your fault. You know that, right? David, her fiancé, the ghost she carried in the co-pilot seat. She felt her jaw tighten. Is that what this is about? You think I have a death wish? I think you're one of the best pilots I've ever seen. I think you have instincts that can't be taught. And I think you might be pushing yourself towards something that looks like redemption but might actually be self-destruction. I need you sharp, Mercer, not martyred. There's a difference. She stood up, anger flashing hot and quick. With respect, sir, my psychological state is my business. What matters is mission success. Did I complete the mission? You did. Did I bring my aircraft back? You did. Then we're done here. Collins sighed. Sit down, Lieutenant, please. She sat, but the tension remained, coiled and ready. I'm not trying to ground you, Collins said quietly. I'm trying to keep you alive because you're valuable, not just as a pilot, as a person. And I don't want to write another letter home. I've written too many already. So I'm asking you, as someone who cares about the people under his command, are you okay? The question hung in the air between them. Was she okay? What did okay even mean in this context? She was functional, she was effective, she was surviving. But okay? That was a peacetime word. A word for people who didn't carry the weight of 23 lives saved and 1 life lost. I'm functional, sir. That's the best I can offer. Collins nodded, accepting the honesty. Then stay functional, because we need you. Those men you saved yesterday, they need you. The men you'll save tomorrow need you. Just remember that surviving isn't the same as living. One of these days, this war will be over, and you'll have to figure out who you are when nobody's shooting at you. Work on that too. She left his office feeling unsettled. Collins was right, and she hated that. She'd been living in a permanent state of forward motion, always focused on the next mission, the next threat, the next opportunity to prove she belonged. But what happened when the mission stopped? When the threats ended? Who was Cade Mercer when she wasn't Lieutenant Mercer, call sign widow, pilot of Gravedigger? She didn't know. Wasn't sure she wanted to know. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm. More missions, more valleys, more close calls that became routine because routine was the only way to survive the abnormal. She flew support for Army Rangers in Helmand Province, provided top cover for a convoy that got ambushed near Kandahar, struck a Taliban weapons cache that intelligence had been tracking for months. Each mission added to her reputation. Each safe return added to the legend. Widow, the pilot who didn't miss. The A-10 driver who flew through hell and came back asking for more. But reputation brought scrutiny. Higher-ups started paying attention. A colonel from CENTCOM flew in to observe a mission brief. A journalist embedded with the unit requested an interview. She declined. She wasn't here for publicity. Wasn't here to be a symbol or a poster girl or whatever narrative command wanted to construct around her. She was here to fly, to fight, to do the job that needed doing. Everything else was noise. Then came the mission that changed everything. It started like most missions: bad intelligence, worse odds, and a radio call that meant someone's life was measured in minutes. A platoon of Marines had been ambushed during a patrol near the Pakistan border. Heavy casualties. Medevac birds taking fire. They needed CAS immediately, but the weather had turned. Clouds hanging low, visibility minimal, and the terrain was some of the worst in the country. Mountains stacked on mountains, valleys within valleys, and between them, all a maze of ridgelines where enemy fighters could hide and shoot and disappear like smoke. Every other pilot in the ready room looked at the weather report and the terrain map and made the same calculation. This was a suicide mission. The risk was too high. The probability of success too low. They'd be sending pilots into a situation where navigation alone could kill you, never mind the enemy. Someone suggested waiting for the weather to clear. Someone else mentioned fast movers could drop from altitude, but fast movers couldn't loiter, couldn't provide sustained fire, couldn't operate in the close quarters these Marines needed. This was A-10 work, close-in, ugly, personal work, and there was only one A-10 pilot crazy enough or skilled enough or desperate enough to volunteer. "I'll take it," Mercer said. The room went quiet, even Collins looked uncertain. "Mercer, the weather." "I've flown worse. Not in terrain like this." "Then I'll fly carefully." She grabbed the mission brief, studied the map. The Marines were pinned in a valley so narrow it barely registered on the chart. Getting in would require flying through a canyon system that twisted like a snake. Getting out would be worse, and all of it in clouds so thick she'd be flying on instruments and hope. But those Marines didn't care about weather or terrain or risk assessments. They cared about surviving the next 5 minutes, and that was enough. She pre-flighted Gravedigger in rain so heavy it turned the tarmac into a mirror. Riordan didn't slap the fuselage this time, just looked at her with something that might have been respect or might have been grief for the loss he anticipated. "Radio's solid. Weapon systems check good. She'll fly. Question is whether you should." "I should." "Yeah," Riordan said softly. "I figured you'd say that." She climbed in, strapped down, and ran through startup while rain hammered the canopy. The world outside was gray water and gray sky and gray mountains somewhere beyond. She couldn't see the peaks, could barely see the runway, but the Marines couldn't see anything either except the muzzle flashes of the people trying to kill them. Perspective mattered. Takeoff was smooth despite the conditions. Gravedigger punched through the weather at 3,000 feet and broke into clear sky above the clouds. The sun was setting somewhere behind the mountains, painting the cloud tops gold and orange and red. Beautiful, deceptive. Below that beauty was violence and chaos and Americans fighting for their lives. She descended back into the clouds, relying on instruments and GPS and instinct. The mountains were invisible but present. She could feel them out there waiting. One miscalculation and she'd fly into a ridgeline at 300 knots. The A-10 was tough, but physics was tougher. She flew by the numbers: altitude, heading, airspeed, each one a thread keeping her alive. Pull any thread wrong and the whole thing unraveled. The radio crackled, a voice tight with pain and fear. Any station, this is Reaper 2-1. We are taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Casualties critical. Request immediate air support, over. Reaper 2-1, Widow, 5 minutes out, mark your position. Widow, we're in a valley north of checkpoint Bravo. Can't pop smoke in this weather. You'll have to find us by coordinates. She checked the GPS. The valley was barely wide enough for her wingspan. This wasn't flying. This was threading a needle in the dark while someone shot at you. But she'd done impossible things before. She'd do them again. Copy, inbound. The clouds thinned slightly as she descended, giving her glimpses of gray rock and darker gray vegetation. She spotted the valley entrance, a crack in the mountains like a wound. She turned into it, dropping lower, feeling the proximity of the terrain through pressure changes and subtle shifts in the aircraft. Her radar altimeter counted down feet above ground. 500, 300, 200. The valley walls rose on either side, invisible but present. She was flying through a corridor of stone with instruments as her eyes, trusting numbers more than perception. The JTAC's voice cut through the static. "Widow, Reaper 2-1, we have visual, you're overhead. Enemy positions are West Ridge, approximately 100 meters from our pose." 100 meters. Danger close didn't even begin to cover it. She'd be firing within lethal fragmentation range of friendlies. One wrong calculation and she'd kill the people she was trying to save. But no calculation meant certain death for everyone down there. She armed the gun and began her first pass. Flying through clouds with mountains on both sides while lining up a gun run on targets she couldn't see was easily the most difficult thing Cade Mercer had ever attempted. The heads-up display showed targeting data based on coordinates, but coordinates were approximations. Reality was messy. She dropped below the cloud deck for 3 seconds, got visual confirmation of the Marine position, saw muzzle flashes from the ridge, and pulled the trigger. The gun roared. The aircraft shuddered. 30-millimeter rounds screamed downrange and impacted the western ridge in a line of explosions that briefly illuminated the gray world. She pulled up immediately, climbing back into the clouds before the enemy could track her. Sweat ran down her back despite the cold. Her hands were steady on the controls, but her heart hammered like it was trying to escape her chest. "Good hits, Widow, good hits. We need more on the same position." She came around for another pass. And another. And another. For 15 minutes she worked that valley in conditions that should have made flying impossible, each pass a calculated risk that relied on precision she'd spent years building. The Marines gave her corrections. Adjust fire 10 meters left, 5 meters right. Danger close. Always danger close. She put rounds exactly where they needed to go, dancing the line between salvation and fratricide with confidence born of obsessive practice and natural talent refined to a cutting edge. When the valley finally went quiet, she was nearly out of ammunition and running low on fuel. The Marines were still alive, still breathing, still able to go home eventually. That was victory, even if it didn't feel triumphant, just exhausted, hollowed out. The adrenaline crash hit her on the flight back, hands shaking slightly on the stick. She forced them still through sheer will. Control was everything. Lose control and you lost everything else. She landed in darkness and rain, the runway lights barely visible. Gravedigger touched down smooth as silk despite the weather. Professional, competent, unremarkable. That's what separated good pilots from dead pilots. The ability to make the difficult look routine. She taxied to the flight line and shut down, sitting in the cockpit for a long moment after the engine spooled down, just breathing, just existing in the space between danger and safety. Eventually she climbed out. Collins was waiting. So were the Marines. They'd been medevaced out and returned to Bagram within hours. They stood in the rain, uniforms muddy and bloodstained, faces haggard, and when they saw her they snapped to attention. She didn't know what to do with that, didn't know how to process the weight of their gratitude, so she did what she always did, deflected. "You guys should be in medical." The Marine lieutenant, a young man who looked about 19, stepped forward. "We will be," wanted to say something first. He paused, struggling with words. "You flew through that, through conditions that grounded everyone else. And you put rounds on target so close we could feel the heat. That's not just skill, that's something else, that's magic." She shook her head. "Not magic, just practice. Whatever it is, it kept us alive, so thank you." He extended his hand. She shook it, feeling the calluses and scars, the physical evidence of a life lived at the edge. These men were warriors, and they were thanking her. The cognitive dissonance was almost overwhelming. She'd spent so much time proving herself, fighting for respect, that receiving it felt alien, uncomfortable, like wearing someone else's uniform. But she nodded, accepted their gratitude with the grace they deserved, and watched them walk away into the rain. And something inside her shifted. Some piece that had been broken started to heal. The medal ceremony happened 3 weeks later. Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation read like something written by committee, full of formal language that couldn't capture what it felt like to fly into a valley with mountains on both sides and clouds so thick you couldn't see your own wings. But medals weren't really for the recipient. They were for everyone else. A way to acknowledge that something extraordinary had happened, that someone had exceeded the expected bounds of duty and survival. She stood at attention while a general she didn't know pinned the medal to her uniform and shook her hand. Photos were taken. Words were said. She smiled at the appropriate moments and said thank you and played her part in the theater of military recognition. But her mind was elsewhere, thinking about the Marines who'd gone home, thinking about the SEALs who'd survived Kunar, thinking about all the missions she'd flown and all the missions yet to come. This wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. Wars didn't end with medals. They ended with exhaustion and political calculations and slow withdrawals that left behind ghosts and questions. She was just one pilot, one person, but for the people she'd saved, she was everything. The difference between life and death, between going home and being carried home, That responsibility was heavier than any medal, and she carried it every time she climbed into Gravedigger's cockpit. The next 6 months blurred together in a sequence of missions that all started to feel similar. Different valleys, different coordinates, different voices on the radio calling for help. But the core remained constant. Americans in danger. Enemy positions to destroy. The narrow margin between success and catastrophe that defined close air support. Her reputation grew, spread beyond Bagram. Pilots at other bases knew the name Widow. Ground commanders requested her specifically for the difficult missions, the ones where precision mattered, where the margin for error was measured in meters and mistakes were measured in body bags. She flew them all, never refused, never hesitated, became the pilot everyone relied on when things went wrong, which meant she was busy constantly, exhausted constantly, but alive, still alive. And as long as she was alive, she could keep others alive too. That was the bargain she'd made, with herself. With David's memory, with whatever force governed the universe. She'd survive so others could survive. She'd come home so they could come home. Widow, the one who lives. The cost was sleep and peace of mind and any sense of normalcy, but those seemed like small prices to pay. One evening, in the officers' club that still wasn't really a club, she sat with a group of pilots swapping stories. They talked about close calls and lucky breaks and the time someone almost landed with their gear up. The usual pilot talk, equal parts bravado and therapy. Voss was there, less antagonistic now, almost friendly. He'd flown a mission over Kandahar and taken some damage, came back impressed with himself. 3 hits, he said, holding up 3 fingers. 3 hits and I brought her back. Someone raised a beer. To Voss and his 3 hits, they drank. Then someone, emboldened by alcohol or genuine curiosity, turned to Mercer. How many hits you take in total, Widow? She thought about it, counted in her head. 97, last time maintenance did a comprehensive inspection. The table went quiet. Voss stared at her. 97, that's not possible. It's documented. Talk to Riordan if you don't believe me. Someone whistled low. Jesus, how are you still flying? She shrugged. A-10's built to take damage, that's the whole point. But they all knew it wasn't just the aircraft. It was where she flew, how close she got, the risk she accepted as routine. 97 hits meant 97 times something had tried to kill her and failed. 97 small miracles, or one massive improbability stretched across months of combat. However you framed it, the numbers were absurd. The conversation moved on, but the weight of that number lingered. 97. It felt like a countdown. Like she was spending luck she didn't have, borrowing against a future that might not exist. But thinking like that was paralysis. So she didn't think like that. Just took each mission as it came. Each valley, each radio call, each chance to make a difference in a war that often felt meaningless. Then the announcement came down. The war was winding down, troop withdrawals beginning, timelines being established. It felt surreal. After so many years, so many missions, the idea that it might actually end seemed like fiction. But the orders were real. Units would start rotating home. Bases would close. The machinery of war would slowly, painfully reverse direction. Mercer sat in her quarters reading the announcement and felt nothing. No relief. No joy, just emptiness. This had been her life. Her purpose. What happened when that purpose evaporated? Who was she without the radio calls and the valleys and the constant razor edge of survival? She didn't know. The war had given her a place, a role, a reason to wake up each morning that wasn't just grief and memory. Without it, she'd have to figure out how to be a person again, how to exist in a world where violence wasn't the solution to every problem. The prospect terrified her more than any Sam ever had. Her last mission came on a Tuesday. Routine patrol. Nothing special. Just a presence flight over Helmand Province, letting the enemy know that American air power was still active, still watching, still capable of reaching down and ending you if you stepped wrong. She flew the route on autopilot, mentally already checking out, thinking about the future, about discharge papers and civilian life and the long road back to something resembling normal. The radio crackled. Widow, this is Reaper 3-4. We have tick. Troops in contact. Request immediate CAS. Her hands moved before her brain finished processing, punching in coordinates, calculating approach vectors, arming weapons systems. One last time, one more mission. One final chance to do what she'd spent 2 years perfecting. Reaper 3-4 widow on station in 3 minutes, say situation. We're pinned down by sniper fire. Can't locate shooter. Came from the east elevation. We're danger close to civilian structures. Need precision. Precision, her specialty. The thing she'd built her reputation on. She dropped altitude and accelerated toward the coordinates, feeling Gravedigger respond with familiar eagerness. The A-10 didn't care this was her last mission. Didn't care about timelines or withdrawals or the politics of ending wars. It was a machine built for a purpose, and that purpose remained constant regardless of context. She arrived over the position and immediately saw the problem. The Marines were sheltering behind a low wall in a village complex. Buildings everywhere, tight streets, civilians likely present. And somewhere in that maze, a sniper who could kill with impunity. She couldn't use the gun. Too much risk of collateral damage. She'd have to find the shooter visually, confirm hostile intent, and eliminate with prejudice. All while knowing one mistake could kill innocents and validate every argument against American presence in this country. She orbited the position, scanning with eyes and sensors, looking for the telltale signs, disturbed dust, unnatural shadows, movement where there shouldn't be movement. Took 3 passes before she spotted it, muzzle flash from a second-story window, single shot. The Marines ducked. She rolled in immediately, lined up the shot, and fired a single Maverick missile. The weapon tracked true, entered the window, and detonated. The building didn't collapse, didn't explode dramatically, just a flash, a puff of smoke, and then silence. Surgical, precise, exactly what the situation required. Target destroyed, threat eliminated. The JTAC's voice came back relieved. Confirm, area secure, widow that was perfect, textbook. She climbed back to altitude and resumed her patrol route. That was it, her last mission. No dramatic finale, no epic battle. Just a professional execution of close air support in circumstances that required precision. Exactly what she'd been trained to do. Exactly what she'd proven she could do better than almost anyone. It felt anticlimactic, but most real things did. The movies lied about war, made it seem meaningful and coherent. Reality was messy and random. People lived or died based on timing and luck, and whether someone like her happened to be overhead when the call came in. She'd been overhead 98 times. 98 times she'd made the difference between someone going home or going home in a box. That would have to be enough. She landed at Bagram for the last time as the sun set behind the mountains. The sky was clear, stars beginning to emerge, and for once the base was quiet. She sat in the cockpit after shutdown, hand on the canopy rail, looking at Gravedigger's scarred fuselage. 97 hits, 97 stories, each one a moment when death had reached up and missed. She climbed out slowly, taking her time. Riordan was there as always. He didn't say anything. Just handed her a small metal plate that had been removed from the aircraft during repairs. A piece of Gravedigger, a souvenir of survival. Thought you might want this, he said. She took it, felt the weight, titanium, scarred and dented but still intact like her. Thank you. No, Riordan said seriously. Thank you for bringing her back every time, for proving what these birds can do, for showing everyone that skill matters more than anything else. She didn't know how to respond to that. So she just nodded, pocketed the metal plate, and walked away from the aircraft that had kept her alive through 2 years of war. Behind her, Gravedigger sat silent on the tarmac, battle-scarred and ugly and beautiful in its brutal honesty. It would fly again. Other pilots would climb into that cockpit and carry on the mission. But it wouldn't be her. Her war was over. The flight home took 2 days. Military transport to Germany, then civilian charter to the States. She sat among other soldiers rotating out, everyone lost in their own thoughts. Some looked relieved. Some looked lost. Most looked exhausted. The weight of what they'd seen and done and survived settling into their bones now that the adrenaline was finally draining away. She stared out the window at clouds and ocean and eventually the American coastline. Home. The word felt foreign. She'd been home during leave, but that was different, temporary, a pause between deployments. This was permanent, final. The end of one chapter and the beginning of another she hadn't prepared for. The plane landed at Dover Air Force Base. She processed out through the military bureaucracy with practiced efficiency, medical checks, psychological evaluations where she said what they wanted to hear, equipment turn-in, signatures on forms that transformed her from active duty to veteran in the time it took ink to dry. She walked out of the building in civilian clothes for the first time in years, jeans and a jacket that felt wrong, too soft, too casual. She stood in the parking lot, duffel bag over her shoulder, and realized she had no idea what to do next, where to go, how to be. She'd spent 2 years with purpose and structure and clear objectives. Now she had none of those things, just freedom. Terrifying, empty freedom. She rented a car and drove north with no particular destination. Just away from the base, away from the military, away from the person she'd been for the past 2 years. The highway stretched ahead, boring and safe, and she found herself white-knuckling the steering wheel. Civilian driving felt wrong, too slow, too orderly. Where were the IEDs? Where were the ambush points? Her mind couldn't quite accept that the road ahead was just a road, not a threat, not a tactical problem to solve. Just asphalt and painted lines and other cars full of people who had no idea what existed beyond their comfortable borders. She stopped at a diner somewhere in Pennsylvania, sat in a booth and ordered coffee. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, brought it with a smile. "You look tired, hun. Long drive." Something like that. The woman glanced at her hands, the calluses, the scars, the telltale signs. "Military," Mercer nodded. "Welcome home. Coffee's on the house." She wanted to say thank you, but the words stuck, because home didn't feel like home. It felt like a place she'd visited once long ago and barely remembered. She drank the coffee in silence, watching people come and go, families, couples, people living normal lives with normal problems. They seemed alien, like a different species. She'd forgotten how to exist among them. She ended up in upstate New York, renting a small cabin near the Adirondacks. Remote, quiet, mountains that reminded her of Afghanistan but without the danger. She'd wake up each morning and go for runs, trying to burn off energy that had nowhere to go. She'd spend afternoons staring at the lake, watching the water and the sky, and trying to remember who she'd been before the war, before David, before Widow. It was like trying to remember a dream. Hazy, incomplete. Maybe that person didn't exist anymore. Maybe war had burned her away, leaving behind only the pilot, the problem solver, the person who could fly through hell and come out the other side. But there was no hell here, just quiet, endless, suffocating quiet. She started having nightmares, not about combat, about silence, about sitting in a cockpit that wouldn't start, about radio calls she couldn't answer, about people dying because she wasn't there. She'd wake up gasping, reaching for controls that didn't exist, and the empty cabin would mock her with its safety. Therapy was mandated, VA counseling. She went because she had to, sat in a beige office with a beige counselor who'd never been to war and tried to explain what it felt like to carry 97 hits and 98 lives saved. The counselor nodded and took notes and said things about PTSD and readjustment and gave her pamphlets she'd never read. It didn't help. How could it? The counselor lived in a world where trauma was something to be fixed, overcome, cured. But Mercer's trauma wasn't a wound. It was a transformation. She'd been remade by fire, and there was no going back to the before, only forward into whatever the after looked like. Months passed. Fall turned to winter. The lake froze. She chopped wood and kept the cabin warm and existed in a liminal space between soldier and civilian, unable to fully commit to either. Then one day the phone rang, unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "Lieutenant Mercer," a familiar voice. It took her a moment. "Senior Chief Hagen, the one and only, heard you were out, wanted to check in." They talked for an hour. Hagen had rotated stateside too, was teaching at the Naval Special Warfare Center. He asked how she was doing. She lied, said fine. He saw through it immediately. "Yeah, I'm fine too," he said dryly. "Which is why I wake up at 3 a.m. and check my perimeter, why I can't watch fireworks without getting twitchy, why I feel like a ghost in my own life, that kind of fine." She laughed, first time in months. "Yeah, that kind of fine." "Listen," Hagen said, tone shifting to serious. "I'm organizing something, a reunion, the guys you saved, the SEALs from Kunar, And some of the Marines from that last mission were getting together. Maryland next month, private thing, just us. Thought you might want to come, put faces to the radio calls. She hesitated. Part of her wanted to, needed to. Another part was terrified. What if she disappointed them? What if they'd built her up into something she wasn't? I'll think about it. Don't think too long. These guys, we talk about you. About what you did, you're kind of a legend. I'm not a legend, I'm just a pilot. Yeah, Hagen said gently. And we're just SEALs, just Marines, just people who'd be dead if not for you. That makes you more than just a pilot to us. She promised to think about it, hung up, stared at the frozen lake and felt something crack inside her. The ice of isolation she'd built around herself. Maybe she didn't have to do this alone. Maybe the after didn't have to be solitary. Maybe there were people who understood, who'd been there, who knew what it cost to come home. She went to the reunion, drove to Maryland with a sense of trepidation that felt almost like flying into combat, not knowing what waited, not knowing if she was ready, but going anyway because that's what she did. Faced things, dealt with them, survived. The reunion was held at a VFW hall that had seen better decades. Inside, 30 men in civilian clothes who still moved like warriors. They stopped talking when she walked in. 30 pairs of eyes locked onto her. She froze, hand on the door, suddenly uncertain. Then Hagen crossed the room and hugged her. Full embrace, no hesitation. You came, thank you. The dam broke. Others approached. The SEAL corporal who'd called her beautiful. The Marine lieutenant who'd said she worked magic. One by one they shook her hand or hugged her and told her what that day had meant, what she'd meant. And slowly, painfully, she began to understand. She'd been so focused on the missions, on the tactical problems and the execution that she'd never fully grasped the human dimension. These weren't just statistics, weren't just successful missions. They were fathers and brothers and sons. They were people with futures that existed because she'd been there. That weight which had felt like burden transformed into something else. Legacy, connection, proof that her existence mattered. They spent the evening swapping stories. Not war stories exactly, memory stories, reconstruction of shared experience from different perspectives. She told them what it looked like from the cockpit. They told her what it felt like on the ground, the fear, the hope, the moment they heard the gun, that beautiful, terrible sound that meant someone was fighting for them. They drank and laughed and cried, and by the end of the night she felt less like a ghost and more like a person, like Cade Mercer. Not just widow, not just the pilot, but a human who'd done something meaningful and was allowed to be proud of it, allowed to accept that maybe she wasn't broken, just changed. And change wasn't the same as damage. Before she left, Hagen pulled her aside. You good, getting there. Good, because we need you. Need me, I'm out, done flying. Not flying, teaching. The Navy's looking for instructors, people who can train the next generation, people who have been there, done that, earned the scars. Your record speaks for itself. Distinguished Flying Cross, 98 successful CAS missions, 0 friendly fire incidents. You're exactly what they want. She started to protest, but he cut her off. Think about it. You're lost right now. I can see it. You need purpose. This could be it. Teaching others how to do what you did, how to save lives, how to come home, that's worth something. He handed her a card with contact information. Call them. Don't disappear into the woods and waste what you've become. She pocketed the card, drove home through the night, thought about his words, purpose. She'd had it once, lost it when the war ended. Maybe she could find it again. Different form, same core, helping others survive. That was what she was good at, not just flying, surviving, and teaching others to do the same. She made the call, went through the interview process. They offered her a position as an instructor at the weapons school, teaching advanced tactics, close air support, survival flying. Everything she'd learned through fire and blood and 97 hits that should have killed her, she accepted. Moved to Nevada, put on the uniform again, but different, not frontline, not combat, teacher. It felt right, different right. The first time she stood in front of a classroom of young pilots, she felt David's presence. Not haunting, watching, proud maybe. She'd taken her grief and built something with it, not a monument, a foundation. I'm Lieutenant Mercer, she said to the class. Call sign widow. I'm here to teach you how to keep people alive, how to fly into situations that should kill you and come out intact, how to be precise when precision is the difference between mission success and tragedy. Some of you will be naturally talented. Some will have to work harder. All of you can learn this if you're willing to check your ego and accept that close air support is about them, not you. Never about you. She saw their faces, some skeptical, some eager, some already decided they knew better. That was fine. She'd been there too, thought she knew. Then the war taught her what knowing actually meant. She'd teach them, not just the tactics, the mindset, the mentality required to fly into hell for people you'd never meet, to accept risk because someone else's survival depended on it. That's what made CAS different, personal, intimate, the most violent form of care. Years passed. She taught hundreds of pilots. Some went on to combat. Some sent her messages later. Thank you. What you taught saved lives today. Those messages made it worthwhile, made the nightmares easier, made the quiet less suffocating. She started to build a life, not the life she'd planned. That died with David, but a different life. Meaningful, grounded, real. She dated occasionally, nothing serious. Couldn't quite figure out how to explain herself to someone who hadn't been there. How do you tell someone about 97 hits, about valleys and smoke and radio calls from people who thought they were about to die? How do you make that comprehensible to someone whose biggest stress was traffic? She couldn't, so she stayed mostly alone. It was easier, but loneliness wasn't the same as isolation. She had her students, her fellow instructors, the community of people who understood without explanation. That was enough. On the 10-year anniversary of the Kunar mission, she received a package. Inside, a photo, the SEALs from that day standing together holding a banner that read, "Still here because of Widow." Below it, all 23 signatures and a letter from Hagen. Some people save lives with medicine, some with bravery. You saved ours with skill. That's rare. Don't ever forget what you gave us. We haven't. We never will. She put the photo on her desk, looked at it every morning. A reminder. Not of what she'd lost, of what she'd found: purpose, legacy, proof that her existence rippled outward in ways she'd never fully comprehend. She was 40 now, older, gray creeping into her hair, the scars fading but permanent. She'd survived a war and the harder battle of coming home, had found peace not by forgetting but by accepting. This was her story. Cade Mercer, widow, the pilot who flew into hell 98 times and came back 98 times. The woman who turned grief into skill and skill into salvation for dozens of people who otherwise wouldn't have made it. That was enough. More than enough. That was everything. And when she finally retired for good, 20 years after that first flight into Kunar, they held a ceremony. Her students, now instructors themselves, spoke. SEALs and Marines, some gray-haired now with children, spoke. They told stories, passed along legends, made her larger than life. She stood there uncomfortable with the attention but accepting it because they needed her too. Needed the story to be real. And it was real. Every word, every impossible flight, every life saved. She'd earned this. The respect, the gratitude, the legacy. As the ceremony ended and people filed out, one young pilot approached, female, nervous. "Ma'am, I just graduated flight school. They assigned me to A-10s. Everyone says I should study your career, learn from you. I just wanted to say, I hope I can be half the pilot you were." Cade looked at her, saw herself 20 years ago, uncertain, determined, ready to prove herself. She smiled. "You'll be better because you'll learn from my mistakes. That's how it works. Each generation improves. That's the point." The young pilot nodded, clearly wanting to say more but not finding words. Cade understood. "What's your name?" "Lieutenant Hayes, ma'am." "Good luck, Hayes. Stay sharp, trust your training, and remember, it's never about you. Always about them." Hayes saluted. Cade returned it, watched her walk away. The next generation, the continuation, the story that would keep going long after she was gone, and that finally was peace. Not the absence of war, the presence of purpose. The knowledge that what she'd built would outlast her. That widow wasn't just a call sign. It was a philosophy, a way of flying, a way of living. Survive, protect, come home, bring them home. Simple, profound. Legacy. She walked out of the ceremony hall into desert sunset. The sky was burning orange and red and purple, beautiful, eternal, indifferent. She'd spent so much time looking at skis from cockpits, from valleys, through gun cameras. Now she just looked, appreciated, existed. The war was over, had been for years, but what she'd learned there, what she'd become, that never ended. It was woven into her bones, part of her cellular structure. She'd been forged in fire, tempered by loss, sharpened by necessity. And somehow, impossibly, she'd survived, not just physically, emotionally, psychologically. Survived and found meaning, found peace, found herself. Cade Mercer, widow, the woman who flew into hell and brought people home. That would be her epitaph someday. And she was okay with that, more than okay, proud, because it was true, every word, every impossible flight, every life saved. She'd done that, been that. And nothing, not time or age or the inevitable fade into history, could take it away. She'd mattered, made a difference. Left the world better than she found it. That was enough. That was everything. She climbed into her car, an ordinary sedan now, no ejection seat or titanium armor, and drove home. The mountains rose in the distance. She'd flown over mountains like those, flown through them, fought in their shadows. But tonight they were just mountains. Beautiful, indifferent, eternal. And she was just a woman. Driving home, thinking about dinner, planning tomorrow, living, finally, completely living. The war was over and she'd won. Not because she'd killed more enemies or flown more missions or taken more hits than anyone else. She'd won because she'd survived, adapted, found purpose beyond the fight. That was the real victory, the one that mattered. She pulled into her driveway, turned off the engine, sat in the silence. And for the first time in 20 years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt complete. Full, like everything she'd survived had led to this moment, this peace. This understanding. She'd been widow, would always be widow, but she was also Cade. Human, flawed, strong, broken, healed, all of it, everything, complete. She got out of the car, locked the door, walked into her house, made dinner, watched the news, went to bed. Tomorrow she'd wake up and teach another class, pass along what she'd learned, help another generation understand what it meant to fly for others, to risk everything for people you'd never meet, to carry the weight of their survival and make it look easy. That was her life now, and it was good, different than planned, better than expected, real, true, earned. She closed her eyes, thought about David, about Hagen, about all the people who'd shaped her journey. They were with her still, not haunting, supporting, witnessing, proud. She smiled, slept, dreamed of flying, but not combat, just flying, open sky, endless blue, free. And in that dream, she wasn't running from anything or racing toward danger. She was just flying, for the pure joy of it, for the freedom, for the reminder that once upon a time she'd looked at the sky and decided she belonged there. And she'd been right. The sky had tested her, broken her, remade her, but it had never defeated her. She'd survived, thrived, mastered. And now, decades later, she could look at clouds and mountains and vast empty blue and feel not fear or adrenaline or tactical assessment. Just peace, just beauty, just gratitude for the chance to have flown at all. That was the real story, not the missions or the medals or the legend. The story was survival, transformation, finding meaning in chaos, building legacy from loss. She'd done that, been that, and nothing could diminish it. She was widow, forever, and that was enough.